The hospital corridor was too bright for what was happening. Under the sterile white lights, William Carter signed the discharge papers with steady hands, then set the pen down, as if nothing of consequence had just ended. A few feet away, Tiffany Coleman sat in her wheelchair silent. Her posture composed, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. In front of nurses and strangers, he simply said he could not continue this life, then turned and walked away, leaving the automatic doors to close behind him. No one stopped him. What he believed he was leaving behind had already quietly moved beyond his reach. If you've ever seen someone judged too quickly, stay with this story until the end. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if stories about quiet strength and justice matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. Before the accident, Tiffany Coleman had lived a life defined by precision. Not the kind that drew attention, but the kind that held things together quietly. She had worked as a senior financial analyst in downtown Chicago, the kind of role where mistakes were measured in millions, and silence often meant competence. Her desk was always organized. Her reports were always early. Her conclusions rarely questioned. She understood patterns, risk, timing. What she had not accounted for was impact. It happened on a late October evening, the kind where the city air carried a chill just sharp enough to keep people moving faster than usual. Tiffany had stayed late at the office, finishing a quarterly analysis that had already been approved twice. She left the building with her laptop bag over one shoulder, crossing the street with the light in her favor. The driver who hit her never saw her. Later, there would be reports, statements, insurance assessments. Words like unavoidable and limited visibility would appear in neat, impersonal lines. But none of them would explain the moment her body stopped responding the way it always had. When Tiffany woke up in the hospital, the first thing she noticed was the stillness. Not the room, not the machines, herself. The doctors spoke carefully. They used terms designed to soften impact, but the meaning was clear. Damage to the spine, loss of mobility below the waist, long-term rehabilitation, uncertain outcomes. Tiffany listened the way she always had, without interruption. She did not cry in front of them. William Carter did. At least in the beginning. He had stood beside her hospital bed, with his hand wrapped around hers, his voice tight with something that resembled fear. He told her they would figure it out. That nothing would change what mattered. That he wasn't going anywhere. At the time, he believed it. Or he believed he needed to. William had always been a practical man. He worked as an operations manager for a regional logistics company, a position that required efficiency more than imagination. He liked things that made sense, plans that moved forward, problems that could be solved. For a while, Tiffany had been one of the things that made his life feel structured, reliable, predictable in the best way. But predictability has limits. The weeks after the accident blurred together in ways that had nothing to do with medication. Physical therapy sessions, insurance calls, paperwork that seemed endless. Tiffany learned how to measure progress differently, by inches instead of steps, by minutes instead of hours. William learned something else. He learned how quickly a life could become expensive. The hospital bills arrived first, thick envelopes with itemized charges that turned moments of care into numbers. Then came the ongoing costs, therapy equipment adjustments to their apartment. The small things added up faster than either of them had expected. At first, William handled it. He made calls, asked questions, argued when necessary. He stayed late at work more often, picking up additional responsibilities, volunteering for projects he would have ignored before. He told Tiffany not to worry about it. "You just focus on getting better," he said once, placing a stack of unopened mail on the counter without looking at it. "I'll take care of the rest." Tiffany nodded. She believed him. But belief, like everything else, began to shift. It started in ways that were almost invisible. William stopped sitting with her during meals, not intentionally, not at first. He would bring his plate into the living room, say he needed to answer emails, that something urgent had come up. The conversations they used to have about work, about small observations, about nothing in particular, became shorter. Then they became rare. Tiffany noticed. She noticed the way his tone changed when he spoke about work. Sharper, tighter. The way he exhaled before responding to her questions, as if preparing himself for something heavier than the moment required. She noticed how often he checked his phone, how quickly he looked away afterward. None of it was dramatic. That was what made it easy to ignore, at least from the outside. From the inside, it was different. Tiffany did not confront him. She did not ask why he seemed distant or whether something had changed. She had always understood that questions did not guarantee answers, and answers did not always lead to truth. Instead, she watched. She listened. She remembered. There were moments when William tried to return to what they had been. Brief attempts at normalcy that felt rehearsed. He would sit beside her, ask about her therapy sessions, tell her about something minor at work. But the conversations never lasted. Something would interrupt. A notification, a call, an excuse. And he would stand up again. The distance between them was no longer measured in steps either. It was measured in attention. By the third month, Tiffany's position at the firm was no longer waiting for her. The call came in the afternoon. Her manager's voice was careful, professional, filled with the kind of sympathy that followed policy. They discussed options, leave extensions, possible roles in the future. None of them were real. When the call ended, Tiffany placed the phone down on the table beside her wheelchair and sat still for a long time. Losing the ability to walk had been immediate. Losing her work felt quieter. William came home late that night, later than usual. He noticed the envelope from the company on the counter before he noticed her. "What's that?" he asked, loosening his tie. His voice already edged with something he didn't name. "Tiffany's position has been terminated." She said it the same way she would have reported any other outcome. Clear, direct, without emphasis. William stared at the envelope for a moment longer, then looked away. "Did they give you anything?" he asked. "Severance insurance, yes." "How much?" she told him. He nodded slowly, calculating. "Okay," he said after a pause. "We'll figure it out." But this time, the words sounded different. Less like certainty, more like obligation. That night, he stayed in the living room again. Tiffany remained in the bedroom, the door slightly open, the light from the hallway stretching across the floor in a thin, quiet line. She did not call out to him. She did not ask him to come back. She had begun to understand something that did not require explanation. People did not always leave at once. Sometimes they left in pieces. A conversation here, a moment there, a shift in tone that no one else would notice. By the time the absence became undeniable, it had already been happening for weeks. Tiffany adjusted her routine. She scheduled her therapy sessions without consulting him, managed her own appointments, organized her documents in the same precise way she had always managed her work. Medical records, insurance statements, correspondence. Everything had a place. Everything was accounted for. Control, even in small forms, still mattered. One afternoon, as she reviewed a stack of paperwork, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. For a moment, she considered letting it go to voicemail. Then she answered. "Hello." There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a measured voice. "Miss Coleman, this is Jonathan Blake from Harrington and Blake LLP. I'm calling regarding a personal matter that requires your attention." Tiffany's expression did not change. "Yes," she said. "Go ahead. It concerns the estate of Robert Coleman." The name settled into the room with a weight that had nothing to do with volume. Tiffany had not heard it spoken aloud in years. "I'll need to verify your identity before we proceed," the voice continued, calm and procedural. "But I can assure you, this is a matter of significance." Tiffany glanced toward the hallway. William was not there. He hadn't been for some time. "I understand," she said. Her tone remained steady. "Tell me what you need." On the other end of the line, Jonathan Blake began outlining the next steps, documents, confirmations, a meeting to be scheduled. Tiffany listened, carefully, completely, as she always did. Because while certain parts of her life had changed in ways she could not control, others were beginning to move again, quietly, precisely. And this time, she intended to understand every detail. The call from Jonathan Blake did not change anything immediately. That was what made it easy to hide. Tiffany placed her phone back on the table after the conversation ended and remained still for a moment, not out of shock, but out of habit. She had always allowed information to settle before acting on it. Numbers required context. Words required verification. And names, especially names she had not spoken in years, required distance. Robert Coleman, her father. The word itself had always felt incomplete when applied to him. Not inaccurate, just insufficient. He had existed in her life more as an absence than a presence. Occasional birthdays, acknowledged with short messages. A handful of structured visits when she was younger, always arranged, never spontaneous. After her mother died, the distance had grown into something permanent. Tiffany had stopped expecting anything from him long before she became an adult, which was why the call did not feel like an inheritance. It felt like a correction waiting to be understood. She did not mention it to William that evening, or the next, or the day after that. Not because she was hiding something from him, but because she was no longer certain he would recognize its importance beyond what it might mean for him. That difference mattered. Instead, Tiffany focused on what was already in front of her. The bills continued to arrive. Thicker envelopes, higher numbers, less room for delay. William handled them differently now. At first, he had opened everything as soon as it came in, sorting, calling, negotiating. Now he let them sit on the counter longer, sometimes for days. When he did open them, it was with visible tension, his jaw tightening as his eyes moved across the pages. "Did insurance process this one yet?" he asked one evening, holding up a statement without looking at her. "I submitted the documents last week," Tiffany replied. "They're still reviewing." "They're always reviewing," he muttered, dropping the paper back onto the stack. "It's like they expect us to just wait indefinitely." Tiffany did not respond. She had already learned that frustration, when repeated often enough, stopped being about the situation and started becoming something else. Something directed. At night, William stayed out later. At first, he explained work deadlines, extra responsibilities, staffing issues. Each reason sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. Tiffany noticed the details, the shift in his tone when he mentioned certain names, the way he checked his phone before answering her questions, as if aligning his response with something already written elsewhere. And the pauses. Those were new. Short, barely noticeable hesitations before he spoke, as if he were deciding how much truth to include. Tiffany did not ask who he was messaging. She did not ask where he had been. She simply adjusted her expectations. One evening, he came home just after 10. Not late enough to be questioned, just late enough to be noticed. "You're still up," he said, stepping into the living room and loosening his tie with one hand. Tiffany sat at the table with a folder open in front of her, papers arranged in precise rows. "I had some things to organize," she said. William glanced at the documents briefly. More bills. Some of them. He nodded, but his attention had already shifted. His phone vibrated in his hand, and he looked down at the screen, his expression changing in a way that was almost imperceptible, but not to her. A message. He typed a response quickly, his posture angled slightly away from her. "Everything okay?" Tiffany asked. It was a simple question, neutral. William didn't look up immediately. "Yeah," he said after a second. "Just work." Tiffany closed the folder. "I see." She didn't press further. William seemed to relax at that. Relief, when it appeared, was often more revealing than discomfort. Later that night, after he had fallen asleep on the couch, Tiffany moved through the apartment with slow, practiced efficiency. She gathered the documents she'd been organizing and placed them into a larger file box she had started keeping near her desk. Medical records, insurance correspondence, employment termination paperwork, everything categorized, everything dated. Control even now depended on clarity. The next morning, she called the number Jonathan Blake had provided. He answered on the second ring. "Miss Coleman." He said, his tone professional but not distant. "I was expecting your call. I reviewed the initial information you sent," Tiffany said. "I'd like to proceed with verification." "Of course. We'll need to confirm several identity markers, as well as schedule an in-person meeting. Given the nature of the estate, discretion is important." "I understand." There was a brief pause. "Before we move forward," Blake added, "I should clarify something. The estate in question is substantial. There are multiple components: corporate holdings, private investments, real estate assets. The process will require careful handling." Tiffany listened without interruption. "How substantial?" she asked. Another pause. Then carefully preliminary estimates placed the total value at approximately $260 million. The number settled into the conversation without emphasis. Tiffany did not react. "Understood," she said. Blake seemed to take note of her composure. "We'll go over everything in detail when we meet," he continued. "There are also certain legal protections we can discuss, depending on your circumstances." "My circumstances?" Tiffany repeated, her tone unchanged. "Yes," Blake said, "including marital considerations." Tiffany glanced toward the living room. William had already left for work. The door had closed behind him without a word. "I'll review my schedule," she said. "We can arrange a time." After the call ended, she remained still for a moment longer. Not because she was overwhelmed, because she was recalibrating. $260 million. It was a number that in her previous life would have represented a portfolio, a projection, something abstract analyzed from a distance. Now it was personal, and personal things required precision. That afternoon, she scheduled transportation to the law firm. She did not tell William, not when he texted to say he would be late again. Not when he came home and spoke about a team dinner that had apparently run longer than expected. Not when he mentioned a colleague, Rachel, more than once each time, with the same casual tone that suggested he expected it to go unnoticed. Tiffany noticed. Names like patterns did not repeat without reason. A few days later, she arrived at Harrington and Blake LLP. The building stood in a part of the city defined by glass and quiet wealth. The lobby was polished, minimal, designed to communicate stability without excess. Jonathan Blake met her in person. He was older than she had expected. His manner composed, his movements deliberate. "Miss Coleman," he said, offering a brief nod rather than a handshake, acknowledging the wheelchair without drawing attention to it. "Thank you for coming in." They moved into a private office. The door closed softly behind them. Blake placed a folder on the table. "This is an overview," he said. "Not the full documentation, but enough to give you context." Tiffany opened it. Inside were summaries, asset distributions, ownership structures, figures that extended beyond what most people encountered in a lifetime. She read each page carefully. Your father structured the estate through a series of trusts and holding entities, Blake explained. You are listed as the primary beneficiary across all major components. Tiffany turned a page. No other heirs, she asked. None with equal standing, Blake said. There are minor allocations to charitable foundations, but the controlling interest is yours. She nodded once. And the transfer process will need to complete identity verification as mentioned, and finalize the trust activation. Once that's done, control of the assets will be legally established in your name. Tiffany closed the folder. How long? A few weeks if everything proceeds smoothly. She considered that. And confidentiality, strict, Blake said. Until the transfer is complete, it's advisable to limit disclosure. Tiffany looked at him directly. I have no intention of discussing this with anyone. Blake held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded. Very well. When she left the building, the city looked the same. People moved the same way. Traffic followed the same patterns. Nothing external had changed. But internally, the structure of her life had begun to shift. Not abruptly, not visibly, but with the kind of precision she understood better than anyone. That evening, William came home later than usual. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Tiffany was at the table again, her documents arranged in front of her, her posture steady. Long day, he said, dropping his keys onto the counter. I imagine she replied. He hesitated just briefly, then moved past her without another word. Tiffany watched him go, not with anger, not with disappointment, with clarity. Because while he was still adjusting to the life he believed he was losing, she had already begun preparing for the one he could not see. By the time the first official documents arrived from Harrington and Blake, the distance inside the apartment had become structured. Not loud, not explosive, structured. William no longer asked Tiffany about her day, unless it was necessary. Conversations had narrowed to logistics, appointments, bills, schedules. Even those were handled with a kind of restrained efficiency, as if both of them understood that anything beyond that might require more energy than either was willing to spend. Tiffany adapted. She had always understood systems, and this, what remained of their marriage, had become one. Predictable inputs, limited outputs, minimal deviation. What made it fragile was not what was said. It was what no longer needed to be said. The envelope from the law firm arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Thick, neutral, unmarked except for the return address. Tiffany recognized it immediately. She waited until the apartment was quiet before opening it. Inside were certified copies of preliminary documents, legal confirmations, trust structures, verification requirements. Nothing that revealed the full extent of the estate, but enough to establish legitimacy. Enough to begin. She reviewed each page carefully, her eyes moving with the same measured focus she had once applied to financial reports. Names, dates, clauses. She noted the details that mattered, and the ones that might later. When she finished, she placed the documents back into the envelope and stored them in the file box beside her desk, out of sight, not out of reach. That evening, William came home earlier than usual. Earlier, but not alone. Tiffany heard the door open, followed by a second set of footsteps, lighter, slower, hesitant in a way that suggested unfamiliarity with the space. She did not turn immediately. Instead, she closed the folder in front of her, aligned it with the others, and only then looked toward the entryway. William stood just inside the door, his posture slightly stiff. Beside him was a woman Tiffany had never seen before, mid-30s, well-dressed in a way that suggested intention rather than necessity. Her expression carried a practiced neutrality. Though her eyes moved quickly around the apartment, taking in details she pretended not to notice. Tiffany, William said, his voice controlled. This is Rachel Evans. She works with me. Rachel offered a small, polite smile. Hi, she said. I hope it's okay that I came by. We were finishing up some things, and it's fine, Tiffany replied. Her tone was even, unhurried. Rachel seemed momentarily unsure how to respond to that lack of resistance. William stepped further into the apartment. We just need a few minutes, he said. There are some documents we have to go over. Tiffany nodded once. Take your time. She turned her attention back to the table, not to avoid them, to make it clear she was not part of what was happening. Behind her, she could hear movement, the sound of papers being placed on the counter low, voices, fragments of conversation that never fully formed into anything she needed to understand. Rachel's voice was softer than she had expected. William's was quieter than usual, not out of respect, out of caution. Tiffany listened without appearing to. Patterns did not require full sentences to reveal themselves. After a few minutes, Rachel spoke again, this time closer. It's nice to meet you, she said, her tone carefully measured. Tiffany looked up. Their eyes met briefly. You too, Tiffany replied. There was no tension in her voice, no accusation. Rachel seemed unsettled by that. People often expected discomfort where they believed it should exist. When it didn't, they didn't know where to place themselves. Rachel nodded, then stepped back. I should go, she said, glancing toward William. I'll walk you out, he replied quickly. They moved toward the door together. Tiffany remained where she was. When the door closed behind them, the apartment returned to its previous stillness. William came back inside a minute later. He didn't look at Tiffany immediately. Instead, he moved toward the kitchen, picked up a glass, filled it with water. She's just a colleague, he said, his back still turned. Tiffany did not respond right away. Not because she needed time to think, because she didn't. I understand, she said finally. William turned his expression, searching hers for something. Suspicion, anger, reaction. He found none. You don't have anything to say about that, he asked. Tiffany met his gaze. What would you like me to say? The question was not confrontational. It was precise. William hesitated. Nothing, he said after a moment. Forget it. He set the glass down harder than necessary and walked past her. The conversation ended there. Not resolved, just unnecessary. Later that night, Tiffany reviewed the documents from the law firm again. Not because she had missed anything, because repetition reinforced clarity. She noted the next steps outlined by Jonathan Blake. Identity verification had been completed. The next phase involved activating the trust structure's finalizing control. There were signatures required, witnesses, legal filings that would establish her position beyond dispute. Tiffany scheduled the next meeting. She arranged transportation. She confirmed the time. Everything moved forward, quietly, precisely. The following evening, William did not come home until after midnight. He didn't explain. He didn't apologize. He simply moved through the apartment as if it were a place he occupied rather than shared. Tiffany was awake. Not waiting, just awake. You should get some rest, he said, loosening his tie again, the same motion repeated from previous nights. I will, she replied. He paused. You have therapy tomorrow, right? Yes, I might not be able to take you. That's fine, she said. I've already arranged transportation. William nodded. Good. There was a time when that arrangement would have been a discussion. Now it was a conclusion. He went into the bedroom without another word. Tiffany remained where she was. Her phone rested on the table beside her, the screen dark. The file box was closed. The documents inside it, complete, organized, progressing through a system William could not see. She did not feel the need to confront him. Not about Rachel. Not about the distance. Not about the life he was already beginning to separate from hers. Because confrontation assumed that something needed to be preserved. Tiffany understood something else. Some things were not meant to be repaired. They were meant to be observed until they revealed their final shape. And William was revealing his, piece by piece, choice by choice, without realizing that each one was being noted. Not for retaliation, for clarity. The next morning, Tiffany left the apartment before William woke up. The car from Harrington and Blake arrived on time. The city moved around her in its usual rhythm, unaware of the quiet shifts taking place within it. When she entered the law firm, Jonathan Blake was already waiting. "We're ready to proceed," he said. Tiffany nodded. "Then let's begin." Inside the office, the documents were laid out with precision. Each page represented a step, each signature a transition. Control was no longer theoretical. It was becoming real. And unlike everything else in her life over the past few months, this was something she could define completely. Outside, the world remained unchanged. Inside, Tiffany Coleman was no longer waiting for anything to happen. She was finalizing it. The first time Tiffany saw the full number written in ink, it did not feel like wealth. It felt like structure. Jonathan Blake did not present it as a single figure at first. He broke it down the way professionals did into components that could be understood, verified, and controlled. Liquid assets. He said, sliding one document forward, roughly 80 million, distributed across multiple accounts, most already consolidated under the primary trust. Another document followed. Equity holdings. Approximately 110 million. These include majority shares in 2 private firms and minority positions in several publicly traded companies. Tiffany's eyes moved across the page, absorbing each line without pause. And real estate, Blake continued, placing a third document on the table. Estimated at 70 million. Residential and commercial properties primarily in Illinois and New York. Tiffany nodded once. The math aligned. 260 million. Not theoretical, documented, accessible. But not yet fully hers. "What remains?" she asked. Blake folded his hands. "Final activation of the trust structures," he said. "Once that's complete, legal control transfers to you entirely. Until then, everything remains under administrative management. And the timeline, 2 to 3 weeks, assuming no complications." Tiffany considered that. "There won't be any," she said. Blake allowed himself the smallest acknowledgement of that confidence. "We'll proceed accordingly." The meeting lasted just under 2 hours. By the end of it, Tiffany had signed 12 documents, initialed 18 more, and reviewed every clause that defined the transition from beneficiary to owner. There were no surprises, because she did not allow for them. When she left the building, the envelope Blake handed her was heavier than the one she had received before. Not physically, functionally. Inside it were copies of everything she had just signed. Proof of movement, progress, control. The driver waited outside. "Home?" he asked. Tiffany paused for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Home." The word felt different than it had before. Not inaccurate, just temporary. When she arrived, the apartment was quiet. William wasn't there. He hadn't been there most afternoons recently. Tiffany moved through the space slowly, not because she needed to, but because she had learned to measure time differently. Each action had its place, each movement its purpose. She placed the envelope into the file box, second compartment, behind the medical records, separate from everything that had come before. Then she closed the lid. Nothing about the apartment reflected what had just changed. The furniture was the same. The air carried the same faint scent of detergent and something neutral, something unremarkable. If someone walked in, they would see exactly what they expected to see. A woman in a wheelchair, a quiet home, a life reduced. Tiffany understood the value of that perception. It allowed everything else to move unnoticed. That evening, William came home earlier again, earlier and alone. He set his keys down, glanced toward Tiffany, then hesitated, as if deciding whether or not to speak. "Did you have therapy today?" he asked finally. "Yes." "How was it consistent?" He nodded, though it was clear he didn't know what that meant. "Good," he said. There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, just incomplete. "I stopped by the bank," he added after a moment. "We might need to restructure some things. The savings account is lower than expected." Tiffany looked at him. "I've reviewed the statement," she said. "I'm aware." William exhaled slowly. "It's just everything's adding up faster than I thought." "Yes." He shifted his weight slightly. "I'm doing what I can," he said. "But there's only so much I understand," Tiffany interrupted gently, not to dismiss him, to end the explanation. William looked at her for a moment, as if expecting something else. Reassurance, gratitude, blame. He received none of it. "I'm going to take a shower," he said instead. Tiffany nodded. When he disappeared into the bathroom, the sound of running water filled the apartment steady and uninterrupted. Tiffany remained where she was. Her hands rested lightly on the arms of her wheelchair. Still, controlled. There was a time when this conversation would have unsettled her. Not because of the financial strain, because of what it revealed. Now it simply confirmed what she already knew. William was adjusting to a narrative in which he was carrying everything, a narrative that required her to be dependent, limited, defined by absence. Tiffany allowed that narrative to exist, for now, because correcting it too early would serve no purpose. Timing mattered, more than truth. When William came out of the shower, he seemed more relaxed. Temporary relief, surface level. "I might go out later," he said, toweling his hair dry, "just for a bit." Tiffany looked up. "With Rachel?" she asked. The question landed without emphasis. William froze for half a second, then recovered. "Yeah," he said. "We've been working on something and—" "You don't need to explain," Tiffany said. Her tone remained even. William studied her face. "You're okay with that, yes?" There was no hesitation, no visible reaction. William nodded slowly. "All right." He finished getting dressed, checking his phone more than once, his movements efficient practiced. By the time he left, the apartment had returned to its previous stillness. Tiffany listened to the door close, then to the silence that followed. She did not move immediately. Instead, she allowed the moment to settle. Not because it held emotional weight, because it marked progression. Each choice William made was becoming clearer, more defined, less ambiguous. That clarity mattered. Later that night, Tiffany reopened the file box. She removed the envelope from the law firm and placed it on the table. Carefully. She reviewed the documents again, not searching for errors, confirming alignment. Everything was in place. The trust activation was underway. Ownership was transitioning. Control was shifting. And William was making decisions based on a version of reality that no longer existed. Tiffany closed the envelope, returned it to its place, then turned off the light. In the darkness, the apartment looked the same, sounded the same, felt the same. But beneath that stillness, something had already changed. Not visibly, not loudly, but completely. The invitation came from Linda. It arrived as a message brief and framed as obligation rather than request. "Dinner on Thursday. You should both come. It's been a while." Tiffany read it once, then placed her phone down without responding immediately. The tone was familiar. Linda Carter did not ask questions she did not already believe she had answers to. William responded within minutes. "We'll be there." He didn't consult Tiffany before sending it. He didn't need to. By the time Thursday evening arrived, the decision had already been made. The restaurant Linda chose was not extravagant, but it was deliberate. A mid-range Italian place in the northern part of the city, the kind that balanced familiarity with presentation. White tablecloths, soft lighting, enough distance between tables to allow private conversations without complete isolation. Public enough to be witnessed, private enough to feel controlled. William parked the car and came around to assist Tiffany, though his movements carried a practiced efficiency rather than attentiveness. He unfolded the wheelchair, positioned it carefully, then stepped back. "You okay?" he asked. "Yes," Tiffany replied. Inside, Linda was already seated. She rose when they approached, her expression composed, her posture straight. Beside her sat her husband, Mark Benson, who offered a polite nod without standing. "Tiffany," Linda said, leaning in slightly, her tone warm but measured. "It's been too long." "It has," Tiffany replied. They settled at the table. Menus were opened. Drinks were ordered. For the first few minutes, the conversation remained neutral work updates, general observations, the kind of exchanges that filled space without revealing anything meaningful. Tiffany listened. She contributed when necessary. Nothing more. Then, as the waiter stepped away, after taking their orders, Linda shifted slightly in her seat. Her attention moved toward William. "So," she said, her tone changing just enough to signal a transition. "How are things really?" William exhaled lightly, as if preparing himself. "It's been a lot," he admitted, "between work and everything at home." Linda nodded slowly. "I can imagine." Her eyes moved to Tiffany briefly. "You've had a difficult time," she said, "adjusting to everything." The statement was not a question. Tiffany met her gaze. "I've adjusted," she said. Linda smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm sure you've done your best." Mark shifted in his seat but remained silent. William leaned forward slightly. "It's just not what we planned," he said. "The medical bills, the changes. It's been hard to keep everything balanced." Linda's expression softened in a way that suggested understanding. "And you've been carrying most of that," she said. William hesitated. "Someone has to," he replied. The words hung in the air longer than intended. Tiffany did not react. She had already anticipated the direction of the conversation. Linda leaned back slightly, folding her hands. "You know," she said, her tone light, but pointed, "there's only so much one person can take on before something has to give." William didn't respond immediately. Mark glanced at him, then at Tiffany, as if considering whether to intervene. He chose not to. Tiffany remained still. Her hands rested lightly in her lap, her posture unchanged. "I'm doing what I can," William said finally. Linda nodded. "I'm sure you are. But you also have to think about your future." The word future carried weight, not because of what it meant, because of what it excluded. Tiffany understood that. She had understood it before the dinner began. Linda continued, her voice steady. "You can't build a life around limitations," she said. "At some point you have to be realistic about what's sustainable." There it was, not direct, but clear. William looked down at the table. "I know," he said quietly. Tiffany shifted her gaze slightly, observing the interaction without interruption. Linda turned toward her again. "I don't mean that unkindly," she added. "But situations like this, they change things." Tiffany held her gaze. "Yes," she said, "they do." Linda seemed to wait for more. There was none. The waiter returned with their food, placing each dish carefully on the table. The interruption allowed the conversation to reset, but not completely. The tension remained, subtle, unresolved. For a few minutes, they ate in relative silence. Then William spoke again. "I've been thinking," he said, not looking directly at Tiffany. about what makes sense moving forward. Linda glanced at him, then at Tiffany. Mark set his fork down. Tiffany waited. There are things we need to consider, William continued. Practical things. What kind of things? Tiffany asked. Her tone remained neutral, measured. William hesitated. Living arrangements, he said. Finances, long-term plans. Linda watched closely. And what conclusions have you come to? Tiffany asked. William looked at her then. Really looked. For both of us, he said carefully, we need to think about what's realistic. The phrasing was deliberate, but the meaning was not hidden. Tiffany nodded once. I agree, she said. William seemed momentarily unsettled by the lack of resistance. Linda leaned forward slightly. That's all we're saying, she added. Sometimes the kindest thing is to recognize when something isn't working anymore. Mark shifted again, but remained silent. Tiffany picked up her glass of water, took a small sip, then placed it back on the table. Kindness, she repeated softly. Not questioning, not affirming, just acknowledging. The conversation did not escalate. It didn't need to. Everything that mattered had already been said, or implied. The rest of the dinner passed without further confrontation. The topics returned to safer ground: Mark's work, Linda's recent travel, general observations about the city. Tiffany participated when necessary. She listened more than she spoke. When the check arrived, William reached for it immediately. I've got it, he said. Linda didn't argue. Mark nodded once. Outside, the air was cooler. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. William helped Tiffany into the car, his movements efficient, practiced. Neither of them spoke until they were back inside the apartment. William set his keys down, then turned toward her. They're not wrong, he said. Tiffany looked at him. I didn't say they were. He exhaled. This isn't sustainable, he continued. The way things are. Tiffany remained still. What are you suggesting? She asked. William hesitated. Just that we need to be realistic. Tiffany held his gaze for a moment longer. I am, she said. Her tone did not change. It didn't need to. William looked at her, searching for something again. Emotion, reaction, agreement. He found none of it. I'm tired, he said finally. Then he turned and walked toward the bedroom. The conversation ended there. Not resolved, not concluded, just paused. Tiffany remained in the living room. The silence settled around her, familiar now. Predictable. She did not feel the need to revisit the dinner. Every word had already been accounted for. Every implication understood. Linda's perspective, William's hesitation, Mark's silence. None of it required further analysis, because none of it changed what was already in motion. Tiffany moved toward the table, her hand steady as she opened the file box once more. The documents inside remained unchanged. Precise, complete, progressing. She reviewed the latest confirmation from Jonathan Blake. The trust activation was nearing completion. Final signatures were scheduled. Legal control would transfer soon. Very soon. Tiffany closed the file box, placed it back in its position, then turned off the light. In the darkness, the apartment returned to its usual stillness. But beneath that stillness, everything had already begun to shift. Not because of what had been said at dinner, because of what had been decided long before it. William did not bring up the conversation from dinner the next morning. He didn't need to. Some discussions did not require repetition to remain present. They settled into the space between people, shaping what followed without being named again. Tiffany noticed the change immediately. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. William moved through the apartment with a kind of quiet efficiency that suggested preparation. He checked his phone more often. He paused before speaking as if rehearsing sentences internally before allowing them to surface. By the time he left for work, the shift had already been established. Tiffany spent the morning reviewing documents, not the ones from the law firm. Those were already in motion. She focused instead on her own records, medical statements, insurance updates, bank accounts. She updated spreadsheets she had built herself, tracking expenses, timelines, and correspondence. Control required visibility, even now, especially now. Around noon, her phone rang. Jonathan Blake, Miss Coleman. He set his tone as measured as ever. We've reached the final stage of the trust activation. There are a few documents that require your signature in person. When Tiffany asked, "Tomorrow afternoon, if that works for you?" "It does." "There's one additional matter we should discuss," Blake added. "Given your marital status, it would be advisable to formalize certain protections before the transfer is complete." Tiffany understood immediately. "A post-nuptial agreement," she said. "Among other things," Blake replied. "But yes, that would be one option." Tiffany was quiet for a moment. Not uncertain, considering timing. "That won't be necessary," she said. Blake paused briefly. "May I ask why?" "Because the situation will be resolved before it becomes relevant." There was no emotion in her voice, only clarity. Blake seemed to register that. "Understood," he said. "In that case, we'll proceed as planned." After the call ended, Tiffany remained still for a moment longer. Not reflecting, confirming alignment. The timeline matched. The decisions ahead were already defined. That evening, William came home earlier than usual, earlier and more composed. He placed his keys down, removed his jacket, and stood for a moment as if deciding where to position himself. Then he walked into the living room and sat across from Tiffany. "We need to talk," he said. The phrasing was expected. Tiffany looked at him. "I'm listening." William leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. "I've been thinking about everything," he began. "The situation, where we are, what's realistic." The same word again, realistic. It had become his anchor. "This isn't working," he continued. "Not the way things are." Tiffany did not interrupt. She allowed him to continue. "I've tried," he said. "I really have. But it's not just about effort. It's about what's sustainable long term." He paused, watching her reaction. There was none. "I can't keep doing this," he said finally. The sentence landed with the weight he intended, or perhaps with the weight he needed it to carry. Tiffany nodded once. "I understand," she said. William blinked. "What I understand," she repeated. There was no hesitation, no confusion. William leaned back slightly, unsettled. "That's it?" he asked. "You understand?" "Yes." He frowned. "I thought you'd at least want to talk about it." "We are talking about it." "That's not what I mean," he said, frustration beginning to surface. "I mean, this is serious. I'm aware." William exhaled sharply. "I'm saying I want a divorce, Tiffany." The word hung in the air. Clear, direct, final. Tiffany held his gaze. "All right," she said. William stared at her. "That's all you have to say? What would you like me to say?" she asked. The same question from before. Precise, unavoidable. William hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted. "Something." Tiffany considered that, then shook her head slightly. "I don't think that would change anything," she said. The calmness in her voice was not dismissive. It was definitive. William looked away, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't easy for me either," he said. "I didn't assume it was. I'm trying to do this the right way," he continued, "without making things worse." Tiffany nodded. "I appreciate that." He looked back at her. "Do you?" "Yes." The conversation was not going the way he had expected. That much was clear. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," William said after a moment, "just to understand the process." Tiffany did not react. "That's a reasonable step," she said. William studied her face, searching again. Still nothing. "I want this to be straightforward," he continued. "No unnecessary complications." "Of course. I'm not trying to take advantage of you," he added quickly. "I just want to move forward." Tiffany held his gaze. "I understand," she said again. The repetition unsettled him more than resistance would have. "I thought you'd push back," he admitted. "Why would I?" she asked. William opened his mouth, then closed it again. "I don't know," he said finally. Tiffany nodded once. "Then we're aligned." The word landed differently this time. Aligned. William leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I'll have my lawyer send over the paperwork," he said. "We can review it together." "That works. And we'll need to discuss the apartment. Assets, logistics, yes." He paused. "There's not much to divide," he added almost as an afterthought. The statement carried an assumption, one he had not examined. Tiffany did not correct it. "Then it should be simple," she said. William nodded, relieved. Exactly. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. This was the outcome he had expected. A clean exit, minimal resistance, no complications. He stood up, moving toward the kitchen. "I'll start putting things together," he said. "Bank statements, accounts, everything we need." Tiffany watched him go. Not with judgment, not with emotion, with clarity. Because while he was preparing to separate what he believed they shared, she was already finalizing control of what he did not know existed. That night, William stayed in the living room again. The pattern held. Tiffany remained in the bedroom, the door slightly open, the line of light stretching across the floor. Nothing about the apartment had changed. Not visibly. But the structure of the relationship within it had shifted completely. From uncertain to defined. From implied to stated. And Tiffany had accepted it, not because she agreed with his reasoning, not because she lacked the desire to respond, but because the outcome no longer depended on the conversation. It depended on timing. And timing was already in her control. Once the word divorce had been spoken, everything became easier for William. Not emotionally, logistically. Clarity had replaced hesitation. Decisions that had lingered in uncertainty now moved forward with a kind of quiet efficiency. He spent more time on his phone, more time outside the apartment, more time organizing details that aligned with a future he had already begun constructing. Tiffany observed the shift without interruption. Patterns once confirmed rarely needed to be questioned. 2 days after their conversation, the first set of documents arrived. William placed them on the table with a sense of purpose, as if the act itself carried resolution. "My lawyer drafted these," he said. "It's just a starting point." Tiffany glanced at the envelope. The firm's name, Mills and Associates, was printed in understated lettering. She opened it carefully, removing the contents without rushing. Inside were preliminary divorce terms, division of assets, spousal considerations, logistical arrangements. Tiffany read each page in silence. William watched her, not closely, but not without interest. "There's nothing complicated in there," he added. "We don't have significant joint assets. The apartment lease is under my name. The accounts are mostly separate. Mostly." The word passed without emphasis. Tiffany noted it anyway. "I see," she said. She continued reading. The language was standard, predictable, constructed around the assumption that Tiffany's financial position was limited, that her capacity to negotiate was constrained by dependency. William had not needed to instruct his lawyer explicitly. The circumstances had done that for him. "What do you think?" he asked after a moment. Tiffany looked up. "It's structured," she said. William nodded. "That's the goal." Tiffany placed the documents back into the envelope. "I'll have someone review them," she said. William hesitated. "Someone," he repeated. "Yes. You already have a lawyer." Tiffany met his gaze. "I will." The distinction mattered. William studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Okay," he said. "That makes sense." He seemed almost relieved. The process was becoming official, defined, manageable. That evening, he left again. This time, he didn't offer an explanation. He didn't need to. Tiffany watched the door close behind him, then turned her attention back to the table. The envelope remained where she had placed it, unopened again, unnecessary to revisit. Instead, she reached for her phone. Jonathan Blake answered on the first ring. "Miss Coleman, I've received preliminary divorce documents," Tiffany said. "I assumed that might be imminent," Blake replied. "I'd like your firm to represent me." There was no hesitation in her voice. "Of course," Blake said. "We'll prepare the necessary filings. Do you have a copy of the documents? I do. Send them over. We'll review and respond accordingly." Tiffany paused. "There's one more thing," she added. "Yes, I'd like to ensure that the timing of the trust activation remains unchanged." Blake understood immediately. "It will," he said. "The transfer is already in its final phase. There's no legal basis for delay." "Good. And Miss Coleman," he continued, "once the transfer is complete, your position in these proceedings will be significantly different." Tiffany's expression did not change. "I'm aware." After the call ended, she sent the documents electronically. Within minutes, she received confirmation. The process had begun. The next morning, Tiffany returned to Harrington and Blake for the final signing. The office was quiet, controlled. Jonathan Blake met her with the same composed demeanor. "We're ready," he said. Inside the conference room, the documents were arranged in precise order. Each page represented a step, each signature a transition. Blake walked her through the final components. "The primary trust will be activated upon completion of these signatures," he explained. "From that point forward, you will have full legal control over all associated assets." Tiffany nodded. "And confidentiality?" she asked. "Maintained," Blake said, "until disclosure becomes necessary." Tiffany picked up the pen. There was no pause, no hesitation. She signed. One document, then another. Each signature steady, consistent, deliberate. By the time she finished, the process that had begun weeks earlier was complete. Control had transferred. Not symbolically, legally. Blake gathered the documents, organizing them into a final folder. "Congratulations," he said. The word was appropriate, but unnecessary. Tiffany did not respond with celebration, only acknowledgement. "What's next?" she asked. "We'll begin integrating the assets under your direction," Blake said. "And we'll prepare for the upcoming divorce proceedings." Tiffany nodded. "Keep everything structured," she said. "No unnecessary disclosures. Understood." When she left the building, nothing about the city had changed. The same traffic, the same movement, the same noise. But the structure of her life had shifted completely, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that redefined everything that would follow. That evening, William returned home later than usual. His mood was lighter, less burdened, as if decisions once made had reduced the weight he carried. "Hey," he said, stepping inside. "I talked to Gregory today. He's going to move things forward." Tiffany looked up. "All right." "He thinks this should be pretty straightforward," William continued. "Given our situation." The phrase carried an assumption. Tiffany did not correct it. "That's good," she said. William nodded, setting his keys down. "I also found a place," he added. "Temporary. just until everything's finalized. Tiffany held his gaze. That sounds practical. He seemed encouraged by her response. Yeah, he said. I think it's the right move. There was a pause. I'll start moving some things this weekend. Of course. William watched her for a moment, then looked away. You're handling this. Well, he said. Tiffany did not respond immediately. Then I'm handling it, she said. William nodded. That's what I meant. He moved toward the bedroom, his posture relaxed in a way it hadn't been for weeks. Relief, resolution, confidence, all based on a version of reality that no longer existed. Tiffany remained where she was. The apartment was quiet again, familiar, unchanged. But beneath that stillness, everything had already been redefined. William was preparing to leave with the belief that he was stepping into something better. Simpler, more manageable. Tiffany allowed that belief to remain intact. For now. Because correction required timing. And timing was already hers. The first formal meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Not in a courtroom, not yet. This was the stage before that, structured, contained, designed to establish direction before conflict required escalation. A conference room inside a neutral office building downtown, chosen less for comfort than for control. William arrived early. He preferred it that way. It gave him time to settle, to align himself with a version of events he had already accepted as truth. He reviewed the documents Gregory Mills had prepared, flipping through pages he had read more than once, as if repetition might reinforce certainty. Across from him, Gregory sat with quiet composure. Keep your responses clear, he said. No unnecessary elaboration. This is preliminary. We're establishing parameters. William nodded. That's all I want, he said. Something straightforward. Gregory studied him briefly. Straightforward depends on both sides, he replied. William didn't respond. He didn't see a reason for complication. From his perspective, there wasn't one. A few minutes later, the door opened. Tiffany entered first, not alone. Jonathan Blake followed, carrying a slim folder that contained everything necessary and nothing more. His presence was unobtrusive but intentional. He did not greet Gregory immediately. Instead, he guided Tiffany to her seat, ensuring her positioning at the table was deliberate, neither passive nor confrontational. Balanced, William noticed, not consciously. But enough for something to shift. Tiffany, he said, offering a brief nod. William. Her tone remained even, unchanged. They had not spoken much since the documents had been exchanged. What remained between them was no longer personal. It was procedural. Introductions followed, professional, brief. Gregory extended a hand toward Blake. Jonathan Blake, Gregory Mills. Their handshake was firm, measured, acknowledging competence without familiarity. They took their seats. The room settled. Gregory began. We're here to discuss preliminary terms, he said. Our goal is to outline a framework that allows both parties to move forward efficiently. Blake nodded. Agreed. Gregory turned slightly toward Tiffany. Our understanding, he continued, is that the marital assets are limited. The primary residence is leased under Mr. Carter's name. Financial accounts are largely separate. Given those conditions, we believe an expedited process is appropriate. Tiffany listened. She did not interrupt. William glanced at her briefly, then back at Gregory. This doesn't need to be complicated, he added. Blake remained still. Before we proceed further, he said, we would like to review the financial disclosures in detail. Gregory slid a set of documents across the table. These are complete as of last quarter, he said. Blake accepted them without comment, opening the folder with controlled precision. His eyes moved across the pages quickly, not skimming, but processing. Tiffany watched the exchange. Not the documents, the rhythm. Gregory leaned back, slightly confident. William followed his lead. From their perspective, this was confirmation. Structure, predictability. Blake closed the folder. "We'll need additional clarification on several items," he said. Gregory's expression remained neutral. "Such as recent expenditures," Blake replied. "There are discrepancies between reported income and observed outflows." William shifted slightly in his seat. "It's nothing unusual," he said. "Just normal expenses." Blake looked at him briefly. "We'll review them in detail," he said, returning his attention to Gregory. The moment passed, but not entirely. Gregory adjusted his posture. "Of course," he said. "We can provide supplemental documentation." Blake nodded once. "Good." The conversation moved forward. Timelines, filing procedures, potential settlement structures, each point addressed with professional detachment. William spoke when necessary. Concise, controlled, everything aligned with what he had expected. Until it didn't, Blake reached into his folder again, removing a separate document. "There's an additional matter we would like to note," he said. Gregory's attention sharpened slightly. "Yes." Blake placed the document on the table. "Miss Coleman's financial position is currently under review," he continued, "pending finalization of certain external matters." William frowned. "What does that mean?" Tiffany did not look at him. Blake answered, "It means that a complete assessment of assets is not yet reflected in the current disclosures." Gregory leaned forward slightly. "Are you indicating undisclosed assets?" he asked. Blake met his gaze. "I'm indicating that the financial landscape may be more complex than initially presented." William's expression tightened. "There are no undisclosed assets," he said. "We've already," Blake raised a hand slightly. "Mr. Carter, we are not making conclusions. We are clarifying that the review is ongoing." The distinction was precise. Intentional. Gregory considered that. "Then we'll proceed with caution," he said. "That would be advisable," Blake replied. The room shifted, not dramatically, but enough. William felt it. A subtle change in positioning. Uncertainty where there had been none. He glanced at Tiffany. She remained still, composed, her hands resting lightly in her lap. No reaction, no explanation. The meeting continued, but the tone had changed. Less certain, more measured. By the time they reached the final agenda point, the initial confidence that had defined the room had softened. Not collapsed, just adjusted. Gregory closed his folder. "We'll reconvene once all disclosures are complete," he said. Blake nodded. "That would be appropriate." Chairs moved, documents were gathered. The meeting ended without resolution, as it was designed to. Outside the room, the hallway felt quieter than expected. William walked beside Gregory, his expression tight. "What was that about?" he asked. Gregory didn't answer immediately. "I'll look into it," he said. "For now, assume nothing." William frowned. "There's nothing to assume," he said. "We've already assumed nothing," Gregory repeated. The words carried more weight the second time. William fell silent. Across the hallway, Tiffany and Blake moved toward the exit. "You handled that well," Blake said quietly. Tiffany nodded. It was expected. Blake glanced at her. "The timing is aligned," he said. "Yes." They stepped outside. The city moved around them without pause. Unaware, unchanged. Behind them, William exited the building. He saw Tiffany across the street. Paused. Considered approaching, then didn't. Something about the distance felt different. Not physical, defined. He watched her for a moment longer as she entered the waiting car. Then she was gone. William stood there, the morning air sharp against his face, a faint sense of something unsettled beginning to take shape. Not a problem, not yet. Just a question, one he couldn't fully articulate. but one that would not remain unanswered for long. After the preliminary meeting, the process shifted from assumption to verification. For William, that meant waiting. For Tiffany, it meant preparation. Jonathan Blake's office did not rush. It did not speculate. It documented. Within 24 hours of the meeting, Tiffany received a secure summary outlining the next steps. It was concise, structured, each action item tied to a specific objective. Financial tracing, documentation requests, timeline coordination. Nothing was left open-ended. Tiffany reviewed it once, then again. Not because she needed clarification, because precision required repetition. Meanwhile, Gregory Mills requested additional documentation from William. Bank statements, transaction histories, credit records. At first, William didn't see the significance. "They're just doing due diligence," he told Rachel that evening, sitting across from her in a quiet restaurant not far from his office. Rachel Evans stirred her drink slowly, her expression thoughtful. Still, she said, "It seems like a lot for something that's supposed to be simple." "It is simple," William replied. "There's nothing to find." Rachel looked at him. "You're sure about that?" William frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Nothing, she had said quickly. "I just mean, sometimes these things get complicated." "They won't," he said. His confidence sounded intact, but it didn't feel as firm as it had before, Rachel noticed. She didn't press further. Instead, she changed the subject, shifting the conversation towards safer groundwork, updates, future plans, possibilities that extended beyond the present. William responded, participated. But part of his attention remained elsewhere. Back at the apartment, at the documents he had submitted, at the questions Gregory had begun asking. When he returned home that night, Tiffany was at the table again. The same position, the same stillness. The consistency had become part of the space. "I got a call from Gregory," William said, setting his keys down. Tiffany looked up. "I assumed you would." He hesitated. "They're asking for more records," he said. "Detailed ones. That's standard for what he asked. There's nothing unusual." Tiffany held his gaze. "Verification doesn't require suspicion," she said. "Only process." William exhaled. "It just feels unnecessary." "Then it should be easy to complete." The logic was simple, unavoidable. William nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I guess." He moved toward the kitchen, opening the refrigerator without really looking inside. "I'll get everything together tomorrow," he added. Tiffany didn't respond. She didn't need to. The next few days followed a pattern. William gathered documents, submitted them, waited. Gregory reviewed, requested more, clarifications, explanations for specific transactions, nothing overtly accusatory, but detailed, persistent. William found himself revisiting months of financial activity he hadn't thought about in that level of detail. Dinner expenses, travel charges, transfers he had made without considering how they might appear when isolated from context. At first, he answered the questions easily. "These are just normal expenses," he told Gregory during a call. "Of course," Gregory replied. "But we need to document them clearly." "Why?" "Because opposing counsel has raised the issue." William paused. "They think I'm hiding something." "They're not making claims," Gregory said. "They're asking questions." The distinction felt less meaningful now. Meanwhile, Tiffany continued her own process. Blake's team had already compiled a comprehensive financial profile not of William's assumptions, but of his actual activity. Bank records, email correspondence, transaction timelines. Each piece aligned, each detail verified. Tiffany reviewed the summaries without comment. She didn't need to interpret them. They spoke for themselves. "Your position is strong," Blake said during their next meeting. "But we don't need to escalate prematurely." "I agree," Tiffany replied. Timing will be important, he added. It always is. Blake studied her for a moment. You're not interested in leverage. Tiffany considered the question. Only accuracy, she said. Blake nodded. That was consistent with everything he had observed. Back at the apartment, the dynamic between Tiffany and William had shifted again. Not toward conflict, toward distance, defined, operational. They spoke when necessary, about logistics, appointments, deadlines, nothing more. William spent more nights away. Sometimes he said he was working late. Sometimes he didn't say anything at all. Tiffany didn't ask. She didn't need confirmation. Patterns had already provided that. One evening, as William reviewed another set of documents at the table, he paused. This doesn't make sense, he said. Tiffany looked up. What doesn't? They're asking about transfers from months ago, he said, before all of this even started. Then they're being thorough. William frowned. Feels like they're digging. Then give them what they're looking for. He looked at her. That's easy for you to say. Tiffany held his gaze. Yes, she said. It is. There was no sarcasm in her voice, only fact. William leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. I just want this to be over, he said. It will be. When the process is complete. The answer was precise, unhelpful, accurate. William exhaled sharply. You're very calm about all of this. Tiffany didn't respond immediately. Then there's no advantage in being anything else. William watched her for a moment, as if trying to understand something that remained just out of reach. Then he looked away. The conversation ended there. Later that night, after William had gone to bed, Tiffany opened her laptop. She reviewed the latest updates from Blake's team. The financial analysis was complete. The documentation was organized. The timeline was aligned. Everything was ready. Not for confrontation, for disclosure, at the appropriate moment. Tiffany closed the laptop, turned off the light. The apartment settled into silence once more. But beneath that silence, the structure had shifted again. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that made the next step inevitable. William believed he was responding to questions, clarifying details, managing a process. What he didn't understand was that the process was no longer reacting to him. It was preparing to reveal him. And when it did, there would be no room left for assumption, only record, only sequence, only fact. The courtroom was not large. It didn't need to be. Divorce proceedings, even when complicated, rarely required spectacle. The room was designed for clarity, not drama. Wood-paneled walls, neutral lighting, a raised bench that established authority without intimidation. Everything had its place. Everything followed sequence. William arrived early again. He preferred control, or the appearance of it. Gregory Mills sat beside him, reviewing a thin stack of documents. His movements were slower than usual, more deliberate. Today is about establishing position, Gregory said quietly. Not final arguments. William nodded. I understand. But his attention drifted. To the door. To the empty space where Tiffany would soon be. When she entered, the shift was immediate. Not because of what she wore. Not because of how she looked. Because of how little had changed. She moved into the room with the same composed stillness she had carried into every previous meeting. Her wheelchair guided with quiet precision. Jonathan Blake followed, his expression neutral, his posture unchanged. They took their seats. No acknowledgement beyond what was necessary. The judge entered shortly after. Proceedings began. Names were confirmed. Representation established. The structure held. Gregory spoke first. Our position is straightforward, he said. The marriage has broken down irreparably. The assets are limited and we are seeking an equitable and efficient resolution. His tone was controlled, confident, familiar. William listened, reassured by the consistency. This was what he expected. Blake responded. "We agree on the need for resolution," he said. "However, the characterization of the financial position is incomplete." The word incomplete carried weight. Subtle, intentional. Gregory did not react immediately. "In what way?" he asked. Blake opened his folder. "There are discrepancies in the financial disclosures provided by Mr. Carter," he said. "We would like to present supporting documentation." William felt it then. Not panic, not yet, but something close to discomfort. Gregory turned slightly toward him. "Did you disclose everything we discussed?" he asked quietly. "Yes," William replied. Blake continued. "Over the past 6 months, there have been multiple expenditures that fall outside the pattern of previously established financial behavior." He placed a document on the table. Bank records, highlighted, organized. The judge reviewed them briefly. Gregory leaned forward, scanning the page. "These appear to be personal expenses," he said. "Nothing unusual." Blake nodded. "Individually, yes. But in aggregate, they suggest undisclosed financial commitments." William shifted in his seat. "They're just normal transactions," he said. "Dinner travel." Blake raised a hand slightly. "We're not disputing the nature of each transaction," he said. "We're establishing a pattern." The distinction was precise, unavoidable. Gregory looked at William again. "This is what they asked about," he said quietly. William nodded. "I explained it," he replied. Blake continued. "In addition to the financial records, we have supporting correspondence." He placed another document on the table. Printed emails, time-stamped, organized. Gregory's expression tightened slightly as he reviewed them. William leaned forward. "What is that?" he asked. Blake did not look at him. "Communication relevant to the expenditures," he said. The judge glanced at the documents, then back at Blake. "Proceed," she said. Blake nodded. "These communications indicate that certain expenses were not incidental," he continued. "They were part of an ongoing personal arrangement." The wording was careful, but the implication was clear. William's jaw tightened. "This is irrelevant," he said. "It has nothing to do with the divorce." Blake met his gaze briefly. "Financial transparency is always relevant," he said. Gregory placed a hand lightly on the table. "Let's stay focused," he said. "We can address this without escalation." Blake inclined his head slightly. "Of course." He closed the folder. For now. The phrase lingered, not as a threat, as a sequence. The room settled again. But the tone had shifted. The initial confidence that had defined William's position had been replaced with something less stable. Not collapse, adjustment. The judge made a note. "We'll require full financial disclosure from both parties," she said, "including any additional documentation referenced today." Blake nodded. "Understood." Gregory followed. "Of course." William sat back in his chair. The structure he had relied on, the simplicity, the predictability, was no longer intact. Not broken, but altered. The proceedings continued. Logistics, timelines, deadlines for submission. Each point addressed with the same procedural clarity. But the foundation beneath them had shifted. By the time the session ended, nothing had been resolved. But everything had changed. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt different, quieter, more defined. William stepped away from Gregory, his expression tight. "What was that?" he asked. Gregory didn't answer immediately. "They're building a case," he said, "for what William demanded. There's nothing there." Gregory looked at him. "Then we'll prove that," he said. The words were reassuring. but not definitive. Across the hallway, Tiffany and Blake moved toward the exit. "You introduced the first layer," Tiffany said. Blake nodded. "Just enough. And the rest on schedule." Tiffany didn't respond. She didn't need to. Everything was moving exactly as it had been planned. William watched her from a distance. Again, the same pause, the same hesitation. But this time, it wasn't just uncertainty. It was recognition. Not of what she had done, of what he did not know. He turned away before she could look in his direction. The feeling remained. Unresolved, unclear, but present. For the first time, the process no longer felt like something he was managing. It felt like something he was inside of, and no longer in control of. The second hearing was scheduled sooner than William expected. 3 days. Not enough time to reset. Not enough time to reframe what had already been introduced. Gregory explained it as procedural. When opposing counsel raises financial concerns, the court moves faster, he said. It's not unusual. William nodded. But the explanation didn't settle anything. It only confirmed that something had shifted beyond his control. On the morning of the hearing, the courtroom felt different. Not physically, functionally. The same walls, the same arrangement. But the atmosphere carried a quiet anticipation that hadn't been there before. William noticed it. Not consciously, but enough. Tiffany entered with the same composure as always. Unchanged, unmoved. Jonathan Blake followed, carrying a thicker folder this time. The difference was subtle, but deliberate. They took their seats. The judge entered. Proceedings began. Blake spoke first. "Your Honor, we would like to present a complete financial disclosure on behalf of Miss Coleman." The word complete carried finality. Gregory glanced at William briefly, then nodded. "Proceed," the judge said. Blake opened the folder. Inside were documents arranged with precision, structured, layered. He placed the first set on the table. Certified trust documents, he said, establishing Miss Coleman as the sole beneficiary and controlling party of the Coleman estate. William frowned. "What estate?" he asked, his voice low but audible. Gregory didn't respond. His attention was already on the documents. Blake continued. "These documents have been verified and finalized within the past week," he said. "They reflect the complete transfer of assets previously held under the estate of Robert Coleman." The name settled into the room. Not loudly, but with weight. Tiffany remained still, her gaze forward, unchanged. The judge reviewed the documents. Her expression remained neutral. "Proceed," she said. Blake placed the next set forward. "Financial summaries," he said, "including liquid assets, equity holdings, and real estate valuations." William leaned forward slightly, his focus sharpening. Numbers, tables, figures. Gregory's posture shifted. Subtle, but noticeable. "These figures represent a total valuation of approximately $260 million, Blake said. The number did not echo. It didn't need to. It settled. Fully, completely. William blinked. Once, then again. "That's not," he began. Gregory raised a hand slightly. "Let him finish," he said quietly. Blake did not look at William. "These assets are held exclusively under Miss Coleman's control," he continued. "They are not marital property, as they were inherited and secured under separate legal structures." The distinction was precise, unavoidable. The judge made a note. Gregory leaned forward, reviewing the documents more closely now. "Can you confirm the timing of the transfer?" he asked. Blake nodded. "The process began prior to the initiation of divorce proceedings," he said, "and was finalized within the past week." Gregory's expression tightened slightly. "That places the assets outside the scope of division," he said. Blake met his gaze. "That is correct." William sat back in his chair. The room felt smaller, not physically, structurally. Everything he had understood about the process, about the balance of power, the simplicity of the division, had been based on an assumption, one that no longer existed. He looked at Tiffany. Really looked. For the first time, not as someone he was leaving behind, as someone he did not understand. "You knew about this?" he asked. Tiffany did not turn toward him. "Yes," she said. Her tone was unchanged. William's jaw tightened. "And you didn't say anything?" Blake spoke before she could respond. "Disclosure was made at the appropriate stage of proceedings," he said. The answer was procedural, accurate. William shook his head slightly. "This changes everything," he said. Gregory didn't respond immediately. He was still reviewing the documents. "No," he said finally. "It clarifies everything." The distinction landed. He looked at William. "These assets are separate," he continued. "They're not part of the marital estate." William stared at him. "So I get nothing?" he asked. The question was direct, unfiltered. Gregory held his gaze. From these assets, and the silence that followed was not dramatic. It was complete. The judge looked up. "Given the updated disclosures," she said, "the court recognizes that the financial position of Miss Coleman is significantly different than previously represented." Blake nodded. "That is correct. However, the judge continued, the classification of these assets as separate property appears consistent with the documentation provided." Gregory inclined his head. "We acknowledge that." William looked between them. The conversation was moving without him, not ignoring him, proceeding past him. Blake continued, "With the financial position clarified, we propose adjusting the terms of settlement accordingly." Gregory nodded slowly. That would be appropriate. The words were measured, controlled, but they carried an acceptance that had not existed before. William leaned forward again. "This isn't fair," he said. The statement was quiet, but firm. The judge looked at him. "Mr. Carter, fairness is determined by law and documentation," she said, "and both have been presented." William didn't respond. There was nothing to argue, not in this structure, not with these facts. The proceedings continued, not as confrontation, as alignment. Terms were adjusted, expectations recalibrated. The outcome was no longer uncertain. It was defined. By the time the hearing ended, the shift was complete. Not announced, not emphasized, simply established. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt different again. Not quieter, clearer. William stood still for a moment. Gregory spoke beside him. "We'll move forward based on this," he said. William nodded, but his attention was elsewhere. Across the hallway, Tiffany. She was speaking with Blake, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. No triumph, no reaction, just completion. William took a step toward her, then stopped. What would he say? The question formed, then dissolved. There was no version of this conversation that returned things to what they had been, because what they had been had never included this. Tiffany turned slightly, her gaze moving past him without pause. Not avoiding, not acknowledging, simply continuing. William watched her walk away. The distance between them no longer measured in space, but in understanding. And for the first time, he realized it wasn't something he could close. After the second hearing, the process did not slow down. It narrowed. What had once been framed as a negotiation became in practice an alignment with established facts. The uncertainty that William had relied on, believing there might be room to adjust, to argue, to reshape outcomes, no longer existed. The structure had been clarified, and within that structure, his position was limited. Gregory Mills explained it during their next meeting. "There's no strategic advantage in contesting the classification of those assets," he said, his tone measured. They're clearly separate property. The documentation is complete, and the timing supports it. William sat across from him, his hands resting flat against the table. "So that's it?" he asked. "We just accept it." Gregory didn't respond immediately. "We respond appropriately," he said. "There's a difference." William exhaled sharply. "It doesn't feel like one." Gregory watched him for a moment. "This isn't about feeling," he said. "It's about what can be supported." William looked away. The distinction had become familiar, unavoidable. And everything else, he asked. The accounts, the expenses they brought up. Gregory opened a folder. "We've reviewed the disclosures," he said. "There's nothing there that changes the outcome significantly. At most, it reinforces their position that your financial conduct hasn't been entirely consistent." William frowned. "I told you those were normal transactions." "I understand that," Gregory said, "but perception matters. And right now, the perception is not in your favor." William didn't respond. He had stopped trying to reframe those details, not because he agreed, because it no longer mattered. Across the city, Tiffany sat in Jonathan Blake's office, reviewing the proposed final terms. "They've adjusted their position," Blake said, as expected. Tiffany scanned the document. The language had shifted. Less assertive, more accommodating. "They're not contesting the classification?" she asked. "No," Blake replied. "There's no basis for it." Tiffany nodded. "And the remaining terms," Standard Blake said. "Division of minor shared assets. No claim to your separate holdings. No request for spousal support." Tiffany closed the folder. "Then proceed." Blake studied her briefly. No modifications, no. The decision was immediate, not because she hadn't considered alternatives. Because there was no need to. Everything had already been accounted for. The next hearing was shorter, less procedural, more conclusive. The courtroom carried a different atmosphere this time. Not anticipation, resolution. The judge reviewed the final terms, confirmed compliance, verified that both parties understood the agreement. William answered when asked. Yes, no. Short responses, controlled. Tiffany did the same. No elaboration, no deviation. When the judge delivered the final acknowledgement, it was not dramatic. It was precise. The court recognizes the dissolution of marriage under the agreed terms, she said. All conditions are legally binding and effective immediately. The words settled into the room. Final, complete. There was no pause for reaction, no moment for reflection. The process had ended the way it had proceeded, quietly, with structure. Outside the courtroom, there was no conversation between them. Not immediately. Gregory spoke with William, briefly outlining the next administrative steps, filings, confirmations, closing procedures. Blake did the same with Tiffany. Everything moved forward, efficient, defined. William stood near the exit, his attention drifting toward Tiffany. She was finishing a conversation with Blake. Her posture unchanged. Her expression neutral. There was no visible difference between her now and the person he had sat across from weeks earlier. And yet everything was different. He stepped toward her. This time, he didn't stop. Tiffany. She turned. Not slowly, not reluctantly, simply because he had spoken. Yes, her tone was the same, even, unaltered. William hesitated. The words he had expected to say, prepared in fragments over the past few days, no longer aligned with the moment. I didn't know, he said finally. The statement felt incomplete. But it was the only one that held. Tiffany looked at him. I know, she said. There was no accusation, no emphasis, just acknowledgement. William nodded slightly. I thought. He began, then stopped. Thought what? That she had nothing, that she needed him, that leaving was a decision made from strength. The assumptions didn't hold together anymore. I thought it was simpler, he said instead. Tiffany considered that. It was, she replied. The answer was precise, unavoidable. William let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. This isn't how I expected things to end, he said. Tiffany's gaze remained steady. It's how they did, she said. Again, no judgment, no correction, just fact. William nodded. There was nothing else to add. No version of this conversation that restored balance. No explanation that changed outcome. I hope you... He started, then stopped again. The sentence didn't complete. It didn't need to. Tiffany understood what he was trying to say, or trying not to. You'll be fine, she said. The statement was calm, measured, not dismissive, not comforting, accurate. William looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded. Yeah, he said, you too. The words carried a different weight now, not assumption, recognition. Tiffany inclined her head slightly, then turned. She didn't wait for the conversation to extend. There was nothing left within it. William watched her walk away, not with regret, not exactly, with clarity, the kind that arrived too late to change anything. Behind him, Gregory approached. We're done here, he said. William nodded. Yeah. They exited the building together. Outside, the city moved the same way it always had. Unaware, unchanged. William paused for a moment on the sidewalk, then continued walking. There was no destination in mind. Just movement. Forward. Because there was no other direction left. Across the street, Tiffany entered the car, waiting for her. Blake closed the door behind her. Everything is finalized, he said. Tiffany nodded. Yes, Blake hesitated briefly. If you need anything further, I won't, she said. The response was not abrupt, just certain. Blake accepted that. Take care, Miss Coleman. You too. The car pulled away from the curb. The building receded behind her. The courtroom, the hallway, the conversation, all of it becoming part of something completed. Tiffany looked forward, not back, because what had ended had already been accounted for, and what remained was entirely her own. The apartment felt different the moment Tiffany returned. Not because anything had been removed, because everything had already been decided. Totes, William's absence had become official before it became physical. The legal documents had defined the separation. The signatures had confirmed it. What remained now was simply the act of moving through a space that no longer required negotiation. Tiffany entered slowly, guiding her wheelchair across the same floor she had crossed countless times before. The light fell the same way through the windows. The furniture remained in place. The air carried no trace of urgency. Nothing had changed, except ownership of the future. She paused near the table where so many documents had been reviewed, organized, and filed. For a moment, her hand rested lightly against the surface. Not in hesitation, in acknowledgement. Then she moved past it. The file box was still there, closed, complete. There was no need to open it again. That chapter had already been resolved. Her phone vibrated softly, a message from Jonathan Blake. All final confirmations have been filed. You are clear on all legal fronts. Tiffany read it once, then placed the phone down. No reply necessary. The silence in the apartment was no longer something to endure. It was something defined. Intentional. Later that afternoon, a second vehicle arrived, not arranged by William, by Tiffany. The driver assisted her outside, handling her wheelchair with quiet efficiency. Inside the vehicle, the interior was designed for accessibility. Adjusted seating secured support systems, everything aligned with function rather than adaptation. It was not a replacement. It was an upgrade. The destination was not far, A residential building on the edge of the city where the streets grew quieter and the structures reflected a different kind of stability. Less crowded, more deliberate. The entrance was wide, unobstructed, designed with intention. Tiffany moved through it without assistance. Inside, the space opened into a lobby defined by clean lines and natural light. No excess decoration, no unnecessary detail. A reflection of something controlled. A staff member approached, briefly offering a greeting, then stepping back without imposing. They had been informed, prepared. Tiffany continued toward the elevator. The doors opened without delay. Inside, the movement was smooth, effortless. When the doors opened again, the hallway beyond was quiet, carpeted, softened. She moved toward the final door at the end, unlocked it, entered. The apartment was larger than the previous one, not dramatically, but intentionally. Every detail had been arranged before her arrival. Furniture placed with space in mind. Clear pathways, open sight lines. The windows stretched across the far wall, allowing light to enter without obstruction. Nothing felt temporary. Nothing felt adjusted. Everything felt designed. Tiffany moved through the space slowly, not exploring, confirming. The kitchen, the living area, the bedroom. Each space aligned with what she required, not what she had adapted to. There was no visible indication of compromise, no evidence of limitation. She paused near the window. The city stretched beyond it, familiar but distant. For a moment, she allowed herself to remain still, not reflecting on what had happened, not revisiting the past, simply acknowledging the present. Behind her, the apartment remained silent. But it was not the same silence as before. This one was not shaped by absence. It was shaped by control. Later that evening, a delivery arrived. Documents, final confirmations, keys, access credentials, everything organized into a single folder. Tiffany reviewed it once. Each item accounted for, each detail aligned. Then she placed it on the table. Not in a file box, not hidden. There was no need. Nothing required concealment anymore. Across the city, William sat in a smaller apartment. Temporary, functional. The kind of place chosen for convenience rather than permanence. Boxes remained unpacked, not because there wasn't time, because there was no urgency. He sat at the edge of the bed, his phone resting in his hand. The screen lit up briefly. A message from Rachel. How did everything go? William stared at it. For a moment he considered responding. Then he didn't. He set the phone down. The room was quiet, not controlled, empty. The difference was subtle, but absolute. He stood moving toward the window. The view was limited. Another building. Another set of windows. No distance, no space. He thought about the courtroom, the documents, the number. 260 million. It didn't feel real. Not because he didn't believe it, because he hadn't understood it. Not when it mattered. Not when it could have changed anything. He leaned his hand against the glass. Cool, unyielding. There had been moments, small ones, when things could have gone differently. Conversations that could have been handled with more patience. Assumptions that could have been questioned. But those moments had passed without recognition. And once they passed, they didn't return. William exhaled slowly. The realization wasn't sudden. It had been building, piece by piece. Now it was complete. Across the city, Tiffany turned off the lights in the living area. The apartment dimmed gradually, the remaining light from the windows, softening the edges of the room. She moved toward the bedroom. The space was quiet, ordered, prepared. She adjusted her position beside the bed, the movements practiced efficient. Nothing required assistance, nothing required adaptation. Everything functioned as intended. Before turning off the final light, she paused. Not because there was anything left to consider. Because there wasn't. The past had already been processed, documented, resolved. There was no need to revisit it. The future did not require reconstruction. It required continuation. Tiffany turned off the light. The room settled into darkness. Outside, the city continued. Unchanged. Inside, everything had already moved forward. Not with noise, not with display, but with the kind of precision that did not require acknowledgement, because it did not depend on anyone else to define it. Morning arrived without announcement. Light filtered through the wide windows, steady and unhurried, settling across the surfaces of the apartment as if it had always belonged there. The city beyond moved in its usual rhythm, distant enough to be observed close enough to remain connected. Tiffany was already awake. Not because she had been restless, because her days no longer required recovery. They required direction. She moved through her routine with the same precision that had defined her before anything had changed. The difference now was not in her movements. It was in what those movements led to. The kitchen responded to her without adjustment. The counters were placed within reach. The cabinets opened at the correct height. Nothing required effort beyond intention. She prepared her coffee without interruption, set it on the table, opened her laptop. The screen lit with a series of updates already waiting. Messages from Jonathan Blake's office, summaries from financial managers, initial reports on asset integration. Everything structured, everything progressing. Tiffany reviewed each item carefully, not rushing, not lingering. The information aligned exactly as expected. Accounts had been consolidated. Control had been established. The process that had once existed in documents had moved into operation. Real, active. There was no moment of realization. No sudden recognition of what had been gained. Because for Tiffany, nothing had been gained unexpectedly. It had been identified, confirmed, secured, and now maintained. She closed the laptop. The apartment remained quiet, not empty, complete. Later that morning, a call came through. Jonathan Blake. Everything is in place, he said. All accounts are active under your direction. There are no outstanding legal matters. Tiffany nodded, though he could not see it. Good. There are opportunities you may want to consider, he added. Advisory roles, investment restructuring, philanthropic initiatives. Tiffany listened. Send the summaries, she said. I will. There was a brief pause. Miss Coleman Blake continued, if you require any further representation, I'll reach out, she said. The conversation ended. Efficient, defined. Tiffany set the phone down. There was no urgency to act on anything immediately. Control did not require speed. It required clarity. Across the city, William sat in his car outside his office building. The engine was off. The keys rested in his hand. He had been there for several minutes. Not moving, not deciding, just paused. The past few weeks had rearranged themselves in his mind, not as a sequence of events, but as a series of missed recognitions, moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, conversations that had felt routine, choices that had appeared logical. Now viewed from a different position, they formed something else. Not mistakes, patterns. He leaned back in the seat, exhaling slowly. Rachel had stopped asking questions. Not directly. Her messages had become shorter, less frequent, not withdrawn, adjusted. William understood that shift. He didn't resent it. He recognized it. The same way Tiffany had recognized his. Not with reaction, with observation. He started the car. Not because he had decided anything. Because remaining still no longer served a purpose. Movement did. Even without direction, back in her apartment, Tiffany moved toward the window. The city stretched beyond it, the same as it had been the day before, and the day before that. Nothing about the world had changed to reflect what had happened. No acknowledgement, no adjustment. That was what made it real. Change did not require recognition to exist. It required completion. Tiffany rested her hand lightly against the glass. Not in reflection, in presence. There was no need to revisit the hospital corridor, the conversation, the silence that had followed. All of it had already been accounted for. Not emotionally, structurally. Each moment had led to the next. Each decision had aligned with what followed. There had been no interruption, no deviation, only sequence. Behind her, the apartment remained still. The table, the documents, the space, everything in its place. Nothing waiting to be resolved. Her phone vibrated again. A message this time. Unknown number. Tiffany glanced at it briefly, then opened it. I hope you're doing well. No name, no context, but none was needed. She read it once, then placed the phone down. No response. Not because the message didn't matter, because it didn't require one. Some conversations had already reached their conclusion. Revisiting them would not change their meaning. It would only extend what had already ended. Tiffany turned away from the window, moved back toward the table, opened her laptop again. The next set of reports appeared. Investment performance, projected adjustments, opportunities. She reviewed them with the same focus she had applied to everything before. Not as something new, as a continuation. Because that was what it was. There was no beginning here, only forward movement. Across the city, William entered his office. The building felt the same. The people, the conversations. Nothing had shifted to reflect the internal change he carried. He moved through the space without pause, acknowledging colleagues responding when spoken to, maintaining the structure that had always defined his role. Externally, nothing had changed. Internally, everything had. At his desk, he sat down, opened his computer. The screen filled with tasks, deadlines, expectations, work. He focused on it, not as distraction, as necessity. Because regardless of what had happened, the world continued. And so did he. Back in her apartment, Tiffany closed the final report. Everything was in place. Not just legally, functionally, practically. The structure held, completely. She turned off the laptop. The room settled again. Quiet, controlled, defined. There was no sense of victory, no need for it. What had been done did not require validation. It required continuation. Tiffany moved toward the center of the room, paused, just for a moment, then continued. Forward, without hesitation, without reflection, because everything behind her had already been resolved. There are moments in life that do not announce themselves as turning points. They arrive quietly, often disguised as endings shaped by decisions that seem ordinary at the time. And only later, when everything has already shifted, do they reveal what they truly were. Tiffany Coleman never raised her voice. She never argued for recognition, never demanded fairness in a way that forced others to respond. She observed. She recorded. She moved when the timing was right. And when everything changed, it did not happen in a single moment. It happened through structure, through patience, through clarity. William Carter did not fail because he left. He failed because he misunderstood what he was leaving behind. Not weakness, not dependency, but something already complete, already defined, already beyond his reach. Some forms of strength do not need to be seen to exist. They do not require defense. They do not announce themselves. They simply remain until the moment everything else falls away. If you've made it this far, You've witnessed a story that unfolds not through noise, but through precision. I'd be curious to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Stories like this travel quietly across different lives, different places, connecting people who understand what it means to endure without needing to explain. And if this kind of storytelling resonates with you, the kind that reveals rather than declares, then you may want to stay for what comes next.